We are the church and we run the state. Even if they don't believe it to be so, it is a fact. And if they keep pushing around with American people and they keep playing all these games, they're going to find out.
How are they going to find out? How are they going to FAFO?
Extreme accountability.
I love it. You're speaking my language, and I don't know how I knew that that was going to come out of your mouth, but I'm so glad that it did. I love you so much.
Okay. That's Candace Taylor. You may remember her. She ran for Georgia governor last cycle. I think her motto was guns, babies, and Jesus or something. She's, the words I'm looking for, nuts. She's there with Stuart Peters. If you don't know Stu Peters, he's quite the extremist himself. And that wasn't too long ago. But you know what was interesting about that clip is at the end, she says she wants extreme accountability. And Stu is like giddy, wasn't he? He's like a little, that's why I love you, baby. You know, he was really excited about her saying she wants extreme accountability. And I was a little surprised by that one too. Why was Stu so excited about that term, extreme accountability? Well, let's see his explanation of what does extreme accountability mean on the Stuart Peters Show.
Extreme accountability means putting on trial the people that have committed these crimes against humanity, and upon a guilty conviction, they are executed on a national stage. I don't care how. I don't care how. Firing squad, guillotine, hang from a length of rope until dead, shot in the brain, don't care how.
Yeah. Yeah. Executions. Public executions is extreme accountability. Hilarious, right? Isn't that funny? I mean, my gosh, that's hilarious. They're making it clear, though, that the Christian church runs the state and there'll be violent penalties for those that oppose it. That should scare you. You know, I mean, you know, the church and the state, I mean, executions, you know, just like Jesus would do, which is not what it is. You know, Christian nationalism is growing and gaining momentum. And here it's like there's Mike Johnson as the Speaker of the House and more of the extremists in the Republican Party are talking about obliterating some of the bedrock principle of our government, which is separation of church and state. We're hearing a lot of that term lately, right? That it's fake, that there never was supposed to be separation of church and state, that it's not mentioned in the, in the Constitution. This is a big thing for the extreme right now. And look, just this week, we saw the Louisiana governor sign into law a bill requiring the display of the 10 Commandments in every classroom, from kindergarten to public colleges. Now, the ACLU is promising to sue, but a similar law in Kentucky was struck down by the Supreme Court. But let's be very clear: this Supreme Court doesn't really give a damn about precedent, do they? They think they've said publicly they believe that this law will pass because the Supreme Court has changed. And this is what it led to this week. This incredible exchange was on CNN this week between the Louisiana representative, the woman who authored this bill, and the host. Just watch this minute or so of conversation and listen to her very carefully as you watch this thing.
This nation has gotten out of hand with crime, with the bad, negative things that are going on. Why is it so preposterous that we would want our students to have the option to have some good principles instilled in them? If they don't hear it at home, let them read it in the classroom. It's no different than the Mayflower Compact, which is mentioned in the document as well. I don't understand why this is so preposterous and that litigation is being threatened. It doesn't scare us in the state of Louisiana. We say bring it on.
Because if someone has a home in which they choose to believe something different, which is welcome in this country, it's literally why people fled to come here to found this country to begin with, then they should be allowed to. And it's not really an option if you're requiring it to be put up in the wall of the classroom. What do you say to the parents of students or even teachers who don't share your religious views?
Don't look at it.
Yeah. You got so kids and parents, if your kids aren't Christian or don't want to read the 10 Commandments that are mandatory posted in their classroom, well, they can just look the other way. Well, that's it. That's a simple solution. You know, they can avoid a sign that's the bedrock of Christianity. We've talked about Christian nationalism on the show a few times, and I don't think we can talk about it enough. They're infiltrating our government. They're bent on building a Christian nation in their eyes, and that has some very extreme things in it. So, as usual, because this is what I do, I got the perfect guest to talk about this movement and this moment. He's actually been embedded in it for the last year. He lives in Idaho, and he hosts a podcast on NPR called Extremely American. You're going to want to watch this one and listen to it. It's very educational. It's very shocking. But I'm telling you right now, folks, it's very important you stick with us on this one. So let's get to it. I am Fred Wellman. You're right here on the Midas Touch Network or wherever you find your podcast. And this is On Democracy with FP Wellman. Let's get to it. Oh, man. Welcome. Once again, I am still Fred Wellman, host of On Democracy, FP Wellman, right here on the Midas Touch Network or wherever you get your favorite podcast. This is the place to be. Man, I heavy chat probably with an old friend. So Heath Druzin is the host and creator of Extremely American. That's a sound-rich podcast series that looks at the intersection of extremism and politics. Now, in the first season, he took listeners inside the militia movement, but this season he's diving into Christian nationalism with the title Onward Christian Soldiers. Among his many fascinating positions he's had over the years, I know him because he's a reporter with Stars and Stripes back in the day, took many of my calls when I was pitching veteran stories, put up with me hanging out at events. So Heath, man, it's so great to connect with you for this series and this important work you're doing now, man.
Yeah, it's great to see you again, Fred. It's been a long time.
It's funny.
It's great to catch up. And, you know, as usual, some light topics, Christian nationalism, extremism, you know, just some fluffy stuff.
I know, man. We used to do homelessness. We used to do veteran suicide. So I think we're pretty much just, you know, those guys, you know, so in the big picture, I guess this is better or worse. It's hard to say. You know, we opened with a montage of clips from a number of the personalities implementing and espousing these political goals. Crazy woman in Georgia, Stu Peterson, who's just crazy. It's clear this movement feels like, for me as an outsider, has been emboldened, you know, and it's growing. You know, tell me what drove you to examine this movement and what you did to research this great series. Because I had a chance to listen to the first 2 episodes already, which premiered today, I believe, or Wednesday. Mm-hmm. We're filming on Wednesday. Tell us what drove you to look at this and what'd you see?
Yeah, I mean, so the short answer is I got the feeling that it started to matter. Christian nationalism really started to matter. Not that it didn't matter before when it was kind of like bubbling in the background, but like all of a sudden I was like, oh, I think these guys are making some progress and like they're starting to get some of their goals enacted. So yeah, I was like, I'm hearing more and more about it. I'm seeing more and more politicians parrot their talking points. Maybe it's time to take a deeper look. And I was also looking for season 2 of Extremely American, and I wanted to do something very different, right? There's only so much you can say about a topic. So what was convenient for me was there's a church called Christ Church in Idaho, which is where I live. And even though they're in this small town called Moscow, Idaho, they have a really big national footprint. And the more I looked into this church, I was like, these guys are kind of leaders in the movement and really like quietly influencing a lot of people around the country, while at the same time kind of trying to take over their town for Christianity. So there was a small story and big story wrapped in one. And, you know, I don't like to just like, my podcast, I like to tell a story. Yeah, I don't just want to tell you about Christian nationalism. I want to take you inside it and tell you an interesting story. And so that's sort of those two things came together, and I started digging in, and boy, we dug a lot. We just every time we turned a corner, there was something new and wild and sometimes pretty dark.
Yeah, I think it opens up where one of the big characters you follow is a guy named Douglas Wilson. He is the, I guess, pastor, you know, sometimes called a cult leader of Christ Church. He's a titan of this movement. I mean, when I was researching for the show, I couldn't believe how much, like you said, how much is out there. The guy's got books. He's got his own publishing company, He really is a major figure right there in Moscow, Idaho, of all places. For me, troubling, of course, the fact he's a Navy veteran, and he brings that up a lot in his conversations. That was great. Who is Doug Wilson? You know, I mean, and what'd you find when you met this person? I mean, I one of the first things I caught, I think it was in your show, was he was saying, you know, one of our goals is non-Christians shouldn't get to hold office. It's, oh boy, so tell us about Doug Wilson.
So Doug Wilson is, as you said, he's the pastor of a church called Christ Church. More importantly, I'd say he leads this whole umbrella group called the CREC, which is the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. So he's got churches all over the country and actually all over the world. And they all kind of have the same really stark Calvinist vision, a very strict Protestantism. And Doug Wilson is 70 years old. He's been doing this a long time. He's been pastoring for just about 50 years, I believe, and evangelizing even before that. And he started off as kind of an obscure small town preacher, but he always had this big vision where he really wanted to spread his message and ultimately change America. So he played the long game. He built this organization of churches. At the same time, more importantly, I would say, he built this sort of Christian education empire. He's got hundreds of schools all over the country, and they all kind of teach the Doug Wilson way, which means biblical principles underscore every subject. And that can be literature, or that can be physics, things that you wouldn't necessarily think. So these students are learning from a very young age that biblical principles should infuse every aspect, including science, which we get into in the podcast. And he's been really successful. It turns out there's a big market for that. People were looking for it. And part of it is because he markets this as a old school private education, like a very serious education. And, we're not going to, the way he puts it, we're not going to sort of coddle your kids like public schools, infuse them with liberal ideology. He sees his as a real sort of arch conservative alternative to public schools. And as you might imagine, these days, with our politics being so divided and this real sort of they are the enemy kind of idea, that's striking a chord. Yeah. So those are the things he's done. He's got a publishing empire too. He churns out all of these books that are really influential in conservative Christian circles. And that sort of made him a leader in Christian nationalism, where he's kind of pivoted in recent years to being like, hey, we need to take this out of our schools and out of our churches and out of our university. He's also got one of those, and make it, make America in our image, in God's image, in the Bible's image, which means, as I'm sure we're about to talk about, some real radical changes to democracy, and some would argue sort of the end of it as we know it.
And that's the terrifying part. I mean, you saw that clip at the beginning of the lady in Georgia who ran for, we are the government, the church is the government. And I talk a lot about Project 2025 here on the show. We just had 2 weeks ago, Congressman Huffman, who just launched a group of his House colleagues are launching a stop Project 2025 task force, and infused it. From my impression, there's this Christian nationalism infused into that plan for a complete remaking of our government and our democracy. I mean, what are the goals of some of these guys? I mean, I guess we'll start kind of where you left off there. Like, what are some of their goals for our democracy? And then how does that fit into this Project 2025, I guess, really? So, I mean, what's their end game here? What do they really see as that government, what that would look like for our democracy?
Yeah, well, so they have a very dim view of democracy, and this isn't my reading of what they're saying. They told me this. So to be clear, I talked to these guys for hours, right? I sat down for probably 5 hours with Doug Wilson. I talked to a lot of his allies. They're not shy about it. They don't like democracy. It doesn't mean they're going to do away with voting, but they don't think voting is this universal right that I would say the vast majority of Americans think it is. They think that, for example, the big one, women should not have the right to vote. Most women. There's some exceptions, but basically they want the head of the household to have the ultimate vote. They say it would be in discussion with the other people in their house, including women. But basically, you have to wait till you're widowed, and then you're the head of your household officially in their ideology to be a woman who votes. Wow. So, yeah, the 19th Amendment, not big fans of that. So if we're talking about disenfranchisement, I would say that's like the biggest thing that I found where I was like, oh, okay. And they say it, you know, they'll tell you, they're like, yeah, I think it was a mistake. And then people who are not Christian, and really that means people who don't share their strict views of Christianity. So sorry, Mormons, sorry, Catholics, In general, they say people with those views cannot hold office. Some of them say they can't vote. There's a little bit of a mixed bag on that. But yeah, that's the big one. Basically, a lot of people get disenfranchised, and representation looks Christian. It's a nation for Christians, by Christians. Other people can live there, but basically other people need to live there being guided by biblical principles and agreeing to that framework.
That's theocracy. I mean, essentially we're hearing as a modern theocracy, a modern, hard, extreme Christian theocracy in a lot of ways, what we're hearing, aren't we?
And they say it's a theocracy. I mean, that was sort of the amazing thing. I thought things would be sugar-coated for a broader audience,
right.
But no, I mean, yeah, I can say that they want a theocracy because, again, I don't have to sort of conjure what they mean. They say, yes, we would like a theocracy, and that is the way it should be, and that's how America was supposed to be. Which, you know, I think a lot of folks in America don't necessarily know the details of their goals, and if they did, certainly the ones who would be on the out group, I think that would give them a lot of pause.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of my challenge. One of the reasons I want to talk about this show. I mean, it's not as sexy as bashing Trump, right? You know, it's not as fun, you know, but I fear that so many of us, especially, you know, in our media fragmented society, those of us, especially here in the Midas Monday, we call our followers and lovely people, we're not being exposed to the truth of what these people are saying. I mean, like I said, as I was researching this, Heath, and listening to your show and doing some, you know, look, the Stu Peters clip is a perfect example. When they say extreme accountability, they mean literally shooting people, like whatever it takes to take over the government. It's a very muscular version of Christianity from what I remember as a child. And then, of course, like I said, the next big thing, of course, is this Project 2025. Russell Vought is a big part of that. I know he's part of the movement. That plan includes extreme abortion bans, IVF, contraceptives, banning pornography is in there. I think, if I remember it, that's an outgrowth of the movement, isn't it? It's some of the same personalities involved in Project 2025 associated with Doug Wilson and these others, isn't it? I mean, they all come from the same bunch, don't they?
There's a lot of connections, and in fact, I actually talked to one of the main allies of Russell Vought, a guy named William Wolfe, at this kind of Christian nationalist conference / festival that's organized by a Christchurch ally of Doug Wilson. So William Wolfe is working with Russell Vought on that. He's a very prominent Christian nationalist, and was actually in the first Trump administration.
Right.
So that's important because this guy could very easily be in the next Trump administration. And he, you talked about banning pornography, all of this stuff. I mean, he is on board for the strictest kind of Christian nationalism that I ran into. And unlike Doug Wilson, who I will say, Doug Wilson has never called for violence, although he uses a lot of violent metaphors.
Yeah.
William Wolfe, there's some tape of him. There's some tape of him out there, and we talk about it in the podcast, where he really sounds like he's saying it might be time for civil war, kind of telling people to bring up or to take up arms, and that's where it really, you get this blurry lines of rhetoric where you've got war metaphors, but then you've got a guy who really sounds like he's saying maybe it's time for war, and obviously, all it takes is one person like hearing that and going, well, I think I need to take action. So that's where it gets a little scary. But yeah, Project 2025, some explicitly Christian nationalist calls in there. In fact, one of the bullet points, Politico reported on this. One of the bullet points in their sort of blueprint was it just said Christian nationalism. So like.
Subtle.
Right. I mean, pretty on the nose. It's not like, okay, we're going to do these things and we like the Bible and maybe we need more biblical rules. It was Christian nationalism. So unfortunately, William Wolfe didn't want to talk to me on the record, but we do talk about him a little bit. And yeah, he is buddies with the sort of Doug Wilson universe and very much connected to those circles and a very influential guy.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that name myself as I studied Project 2025 or getting ready for it, and it's so blatant and obvious as a blueprint. Perfect place to take a break for our great sponsor. But I do want to come back because the one thing is you're talking, I keep hearing about intersections of different movements and stuff you've studied. So we're going to come back and talk about that in just a second. So let's hear from our great sponsors. If you're like me, you understand the pain of finding out what to wear each day. I mean, most clothes I have are uncomfortable, never actually the size I really am, and not to mention how much time is wasted trying to find a good outfit. And when you do have a good fit, you can only wear it for a few hours. We have to change for an important meeting or dinner, find a new outfit. Now, everyone wants to dress well at all times because simply put, it's a confidence booster, even for men like me. Men's closets were due for a radical overhaul and reinvention, and Rhone stepped up to the challenge. Rhone's commuter collection is the most comfortable, breathable, and flexible set of products known to man, and here's why. Rhone helps you get ready for any occasion with the commuter collection, which offers the world's most comfortable pants, dress shirts, quarter zips, and polos. You've never have to worry about what to wear when you have the Rhone commuter collection. With Gold Fusion anti-odor technology, you'll be smelling fresh and clean all day long. And on top of that, Rhone is 100% machine washable, so you can just ditch it all in the dry cleaner or ditch the dry cleaner completely, put it all in your own washing machine yourself. You know, I'm obsessed with the Rhone commuter collection. We're on the move a lot, whether it's I'm catching a flight or I'm going to a meeting or whatever. The Rhone commuter collection has never let me down so far. The commuter collection can get you through any workday and straight into whatever comes next. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to head to Rhone.com/Fred. Use promo code Fred to save 20% off your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to RHONE.com/Fred and use code Fred. It's time for you to find your corner office of comfort. Check out our sponsor, Rhone. I hope you'll buy some outfits today. As I said right before the break there, you know, last season of Extremely American, you focused on the militia movement, the Patriot movement, and that was shocking. I remember you sent me something. I listened to it, and of course, that's gotten a lot of coverage since then. We've talked about it here on the show. But, you know, what's interesting about Idaho, I interviewed Kaylee Peterson, who's running for Congress there in Idaho, in the northern Idaho, and Kaylee's told me about her opponent there, the Republican who's the incumbent, who goes to a church that is a militia, sort of a militia-tied church. It almost feels like there's an intersection now too. Are you seeing an intersection with what you did last season, the growth of the Patriot movement, and the intersection of Christian nationalism with this violent backing? Right, it almost feels like they've got their own little army too. Did you see that between these two seasons, the work you've done the last 2-3 years?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, yes, there are connections. There are connections, and if you are in a militia, you are not necessarily Christian nationalists.
Okay.
But there are Christian nationalists in militias, and there are Christian nationalists who are supportive of that movement, or at least are good with them doing what they do. Mm-hmm. Now, there's also, I mean, you know, I know people kind of hate nuance these days sometimes, but there's all these cross currents where there's also militia members who are like, no, take your Christian prince away. That's not what we're fighting for. We're fighting for what we see as sort of the pure Constitution, which they believe strongly in the separation of church and state. So there's a clash going on there. But there are certainly armed groups who have plenty of Christian nationalists within their ranks. The Proud Boys are not a militia, but they are sort of militia adjacent, or they're sort of like street brawlers. Obviously, they had a role in January 6th. There's a lot of Christian nationalist currents that go through that group. Yeah. So yes, some of these guys definitely swim in the same waters, and I certainly don't think a more Christian nationalist government would keep militias at arm's length. They have a lot of common goals in general, with the caveat that some militia groups do explicitly reject Christian nationalism. Now, it would be interesting to see how that lined up, right? Because even the militia groups that reject Christian nationalism, they certainly have some common interests in a more conservative ideology. So I don't know how that would shake out if, say, Trump wins and more Christian nationalist ideas start getting implemented in the government. I don't know where those sort of anti-Christian nationalist militias would fall.
Yeah. And another undercurrent, and that's the thing. The other undercurrent I was thinking about as you were talking is, and forgive me because it's not in my book, but there's also a series of churches that are being built outside of military installations. A 3-star general just recently got in trouble because he's been preaching at these churches, and their goal is to recruit military members into their church, and they're building them all around the world. Is that sort of the same? Is that the same movement? Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Like, it just feels like there is an intersection where they realize a military or an armed portion of this may be necessary for them to achieve their goals. Did you hear that in your conversations?
So I didn't really get into specific recruitment of military members, but I will say in reporting certainly on militias, there's a big push. There's a big push to get military members in. And on the Christian nationalist side, I will say there's a big push to get more Christianity into the military. So I guess that's maybe two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. They certainly want those currents to be in the military because they see the military as having kind of gone woke. Right. They say. Right. They are very uncomfortable with the military. Well, actually, they're uncomfortable with the military having women. Christian nationalists don't want women in the military. Yeah. So we don't even need to get to the LGBTQ community in the military. They don't want women in that community or in the military. They certainly don't want any non-straight male in the military. So they want leaders in the military to share their Christian ideals, and they want that military to kind of go back to the old days where it was less accepting and more of a kind of Christian white male old boys club. Yeah.
Wow. Now there is pushback, right? I mean, other just in Moscow, there's pushback against this movement. There's a lot of pushback in Christchurch from what I'm seeing. I saw the interview that Doug did, this story, I think Meet the Press did a story about a year ago, probably just you're kicking off your work, that there is pushback, right? A lot of people see them not so much as a church, almost a cult in a lot of ways. And people have left. They've been abused in the church as far as, what did you hear from those who had a falling out? I mean, what were kind of stories you heard in your conversations with those folks? I know they're a part of your story as you go forward. What did you hear from those who moved away from it, and what pushed them out?
So we spoke to people who left the church, and especially women who left the church. What they tell me is that there's a real undercurrent of misogyny. Yeah. That basically they are taught that women are there to obey. And I mean, to be frank, Doug Wilson himself says that, wives need to be obedient to their husbands. That's the vow they take, and that's how it should be. Now, he also says he rejects any kind of abuse of women, and that he's not fostering that. Now, these women told me very differently. They said, basically, we grew up in a way that taught us to be obedient to men, and that really opens up women to being vulnerable to abuse, and it kind of teaches men that there's an environment where they can abuse women. So what these women said was basically, and we have one really powerful story from a survivor who says she was groomed by a teacher in a Christchurch affiliated school. And she's like, I wanted desperately to get out of it, but I didn't know how, and I didn't think I could say no to this respected church elder man who was abusing me. So the undercurrent of abuse that people who have left the church talk about is pretty shocking. And I want to be clear that Doug Wilson and church members say, hey, like, these things happen, but it doesn't happen at a bigger rate than general society. And frankly, that's a number that doesn't really exist, and it's hard to really say one way or another. Yeah. But what there's no doubt about is that there has been abuse, and that some of the people who have been abused say that church doctrine made them vulnerable.
Which is scary. And so going to those who oppose them, because one of the questions I know my viewers will ask, and I encourage everybody to make comments, and I try to reply. Who's pushing back? Like, is there an opposition to this movement? I mean, I think you did talk to opponents, specifically in Moscow, but in larger as well. Who's pushing back, and what is the fight? How are they mounting this fight? Is there hope? I guess I should ask. I mean, who is fighting this movement?
Yeah, well, so in Moscow, there's this little town where Christchurch is trying to make it a Christian town,
which is a university town, right? It's a university town, right? It's a liberal university. Yeah, it's like one of the bluest towns in Idaho, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what makes that sort of micro story so interesting.
In a very red state, you know.
Oh, I mean, it's one of the reddest states in the country, like absolutely one party state.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there you got business owners and activists who are trying to get people to push back against Christchurch and not patronize businesses that are connected to them, and they're trying at the planning and zoning and city level to question developments that might be connected to Christchurch. On the macro level, you've got activists. So what's interesting is you do have a lot of Christians who are pushing back, and you'll hear from a lot of Christians on my podcast. It's not just like I don't just go to the local hippie to ask them, hey, what do you think of this? Not that everybody's opinion isn't valid, but I think it's much more interesting when you get sort of an inside critique. And there's a lot of Christians who are like, hey, this doesn't represent Christianity. They see Christian nationalism as a movement that's focused on power, and they see it as very sort of antithetical to their reading of Jesus's teachings. And you'll hear from people like that in the podcast who come from a Christian perspective and say, hey, this movement doesn't represent us, and we want Christians to understand that Christian nationalism is not Christianity. It's a political movement that's looking to get power. And you'll hear from some very prominent Christians like Francis Collins, who used to head the NIH and is one of the leading scientists in the country and a devout Christian, giving his Christian and scientific critique of Christian nationalism. So those are the kinds of people who are pushing back, some really big names. But I think there's still a disconnect in society where a lot of people probably don't understand what Christian nationalism means, and sometimes just think it's Christians. It's just sort of Christianity, but it really is a political movement.
Right. Right. I mean, and you see that in another undercurrent, right? Circling back to what you said earlier, the schools, right? I mean, we've had this conversation. I just had the school moms and Kingdom of Rage authors on the show talking about how I see the tie in there, right? The voucher movement, the private schools in Oklahoma, they did get just slapped down by the Oklahoma Supreme Court, where they're going to use taxpayer funds for a Christian school. So it seems like there's also this educational aspect of this, where they're trying to build a new generation of people who believe in these things. But there is pushback against that as well at the local level. But I think what's important for me as we got ready for the show is making sure our viewers understand that this is happening, and a lot of it is kind of covered in code words. A lot of it that's why I ran that first clip. The code word was extreme, accountability. And then I showed you what Stu Peters means, what he means by extreme accountability. They do a lot of these code words, try and sneak it by us. I mean, do you think we're asleep at the wheel? I mean, I'll be very honest. I mean, and I know you're a neutral observer, you're a journalist, but looking at the larger picture, they're moving pretty forward, pretty strongly. Do you think most of Americans are asleep at the wheel at what's happening?
Yes.
Okay.
I think people are asleep. I think, what I tell people is, whatever your viewpoint is, what I hope you take away from my podcast is that things are happening at the local level that people don't pay attention to. And Christian nationalists are very much paying attention to local governance, and they're very patient. They're playing the long game. You mentioned school boards. You mentioned education. These guys have a whole blueprint where they want you to increase influence in your town. Run for school board, run for library board. Libraries are another battleground. Mm-hmm. They want you to run for planning and zoning. All the things that, frankly, most of us, including myself until maybe recently, didn't pay nearly enough attention to, right? We just don't pay attention. Like right. You can't name your library board members in general. Maybe you can name your school board members if you've got a kid in school. But if you don't, probably not. Right. So yes, education is a huge battleground. Doug Wilson, the head of Christchurch, he calls his students human munitions. Like, he sees them as weapons in the culture war. And Christian nationalists are really good at that. They're really good at developing education over a long period of time and to sort of planning how to get more influence in their local communities.
Wow. Yeah.
In a way, I would say their opposition is less good at. I do think that the Christian nationalist movement has a big head start on people who oppose them.
Yeah, and we've seen that here where I live in Missouri, right? Where the Moss for Liberty types, extreme religious people took over one of our school boards, and finally those who counter it did organize and were able to take the school board back. But we still have problems. There's the national news is Francis Howell School District up north of us in St. Charles. Same thing. They've taken over. They're doing crazy things right and left. They just got rid of a whole program that was used in the schools because it was too woke. They won't say what woke means, but what I found interesting, especially as I was getting ready for our show, and you guys talk about science in the podcast. One of the curriculums was a physics curriculum. That somehow a video series on physics was woke, and these, and now you say, as you highlight in the podcast, they have a science curriculum for Christians basically. There's some really scary stuff, and I can't help but find myself. I mean, let's be honest. I served in Iraq. I think you popped over there. I think or Afghanistan. It's not a lot different than what we faced overseas. We thought was so evil. Iran is a theocracy, right? Yeah, they have elections. They elect a president, but the guy in charge, the religious leader, is the one who chooses them and allows them to run or not run. So it's almost what they want in a lot of ways right here in America in 2024, which is really scary to a lot of people. I guess the most important question is, because I know I don't want to take all your day. Where can I understand the first two episodes are actually posted. I had a chance to listen to them. Where can our viewers find Extremely American? What's the best place to track it and follow you?
As they say in the business, you can find it everywhere you find podcasts. My partners, Boise State Public Radio and NPR, doing the distribution. You could go over to either one of those and find it, but it's also everywhere. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, NPR One. It's out there. And most importantly, it don't cost nothing. Yeah, it's free.
There you go.
It's free. So yeah. First two episodes are out. Every Wednesday, a new episode will drop until the season's out. So hopefully you guys will enjoy. It's been a wild journey for sure.
It sounds like it. And I just love the reporting. I mean, again, it's so important that I love the style of reporting, but lets you take the time to go deep into a topic like this and find the information. Again, I think so many of us in our busy lives, 15-minute bites of everything. It's so important we know what's going on and what the future of our country holds. So, man, I really appreciate it. Again, Heath, man, it is so good to see you. It's so good to have you join us here on the Midas Touch Network, and I wish you the best of luck and keep up the good work, brother.
Thanks so much, Fred. Good to see you.
Good seeing you too. Great conversation. Terrifying conversation. Heath and I talked a little bit just now after we finished taping, and we kept talking again about the checks and balances. So something you hear a lot from me if you followed the show for a while, or my writing or my social media channels, is I talk a lot about how much we relied in the past on basically handshake deals, right? We call them the norms and traditions. Norms and traditions. That was a norm and tradition. And we saw this a lot in the Trump administration, where the norms and tradition was like, if somebody did something like the sold stuff in the White House, well, norms and traditions dictated they would be prosecuted, they'd be fired. But all that went out the window with Trump. And that's what's happening now. And one thing Heath said, it really caught my ear in our conversations for the show, was that a lot of people really we're kind of asleep at what's going on. So many of us, even people here in our network, or you who watch the show regularly, this won't happen. There's barriers, there's guardrails. We always hear the guardrail talk, right? But that's not true. Right? These guys and these women, mostly guys, have been planning this. They've been infiltrating the things they want to do. They're, like you mentioned in the show, they're running for school board. They're going into the government. This Project 2025 is recruiting people like these folks to go into our government. They are truly aware of what the guardrails are and therefore can avoid them. And if you looked at one thing, that the fear that so many of us have of a second Trump administration is that the first one was practice. And when they got stymied by those guardrails, they're now planning to dismantle those guardrails. Like, they've got guys sitting in the wings when he says, "So help me God," and they're going to come running in like a NASCAR pit crew, and they're going to dismantle guardrails, okay, on day one. And you're just going to see them going to the junkyard because they have every intention of dismantling our government. And if they don't win this time, Project 2025 becomes 2029. They aren't going to quit. They've been at this a long time. They plan to dismantle our democracy. You heard it. Handmaid's Tale. This is it. It really is. Heath joked that it came up a lot in his reporting, that term. So I know it's not a fun topic, and I know it probably scares you, but I kind of want you to be scared. I want you to be aware. I want you to hear what's happening at your school board, hear what's happening in your city councils, hear what those weird candidates are saying on the right. Encourage your neighbors so they understand that if that guy wins, if extreme Christian nationalists like these guys, if they win their races, they will implement things. If you didn't see it this week, just I think Tuesday, congressman from Montana wants to put an amendment into the National Defense Authorization Act to stop funding of IVF. He's against IVF. He believes it kills babies. So he wants in vitro fertilization cut out of the DOD. Thousands of troops, wounded soldiers who can't have children, rely on IVF. And he wants to strip that because, well, he's against it. And since he's against it, our 2 million service members and their families for another million or more will be stripped of a right, a modern healthcare right, because of his religion. So this is very serious. So take this next election seriously. Along that line of Christian nationalists who are very dangerous, I know I've been updating you regularly on my lawsuit with Mr. Flynn. There actually something happened this week though, and this week we found out that our federal court case has been stayed temporarily while the appeal of Rick Wilson's case in Florida state courts. It works its way through the appeals process. If you don't know, Rick was sued also by Mr. Flynn and the same law firm, but they sued in Florida state court against him for reasons I don't know. And that was for almost very similar tweets to mine, as it turns out. Rick's case was thrown out by the state courts. It was dismissed. Mr. Flynn has appealed that and is now working its way through the Florida state appeals process. Our federal magistrate has said that she would like to wait to the results of that case and make that case binding on ours, since they would be following Florida law and the decision on the lawsuit against me for now a single tweet, one tweet over 2 years ago. So we are stayed. I don't know how long it's going to take. It's working its way through the appeals process. If they win the appeal, things get really interesting for me very quickly. If they lose, then maybe our case is gone. Either way, we have to prepare for all contingencies. We actually don't have enough funds really and resources to participate in Rick Wilson's case. So hopefully it works out well for him. And if it works out well for him, it works out well for me too. But in the meantime, all of your support matters. Your support for my legal defense fund has been so humbling and so important. I'm not gonna lie to you, this is still costing us money, which is their goal. None of that money goes to me. I think that came up in a response. Somebody asked me, no, I don't get any of that. As a matter of fact, my legal defense fund is managed by my lawyer, Mark Zaid and Brad Moss. I don't even see the money. So I really appreciate your support. It means the world to me. But that's the latest update on that fund. As well as the other things going on, Forgotten Democrats, everything else. We're doing a lot right now. You're in the midst of your primaries. If you haven't seen them yet, the In the Hot Seat interviews on the Midas Touch Network are going great. We were laughing before the show started because I'm 2 for 2 this week. I interviewed Tricia Calvarese in Colorado 4. I interviewed John Avalon in New York 1. They both won their primaries yesterday or Tuesday. It's come on the show, candidates. Come get an interview on In the Hot Seat with Fred Wellman. I'd love to talk to you. If you're not watching those, I really encourage you. You're going to meet some incredible candidates from across the country. I am so excited about the interviews I'm booking right now. Going to talk to Angela Alsobrooks up in Maryland, a couple others. You're going to want to see those shows. So they're on the Midas Touch Network, In the Hot Seat with FP Wellman. I'm not going to keep you much longer. A lot to think about this week as we go into July 4th next week, right? July 4th, our Independence Day. Keep in mind, our independence is on the line. Our freedom as democracy is on the line. So stay in the fight. We'll see you here next week.